That evening, Father Agostino was trying to stay positive in his conversation with Brother Giulio. They were considering how much longer the Pope should remain in Avignon. Many were urging the Holy Father back to Rome so that he would not be seen as taking the French side in its war with England. It was hard, though, for the young men to keep their minds off the great pestilence that had just a few weeks before come to Florence. While their monastery was well outside the city, providing some protection, many of the monks had fled the country with the nobles. Agostino watched Brother Giulio's hand tremble as the monk wiped his wet forehead with his sleeve. The young man was on edge and fatigued, for the two had heard what the plague had done in Sicily and Venice and Marseille. There had been rumors of earthquakes and whole towns collapsing where the pestilence had hit. Some reported that animals, too, were being taken in the plague, and even birds had been falling from the sky dead. Young Father Agostino had just taken his vows, and God had filled his heart with courage. He would stay and face death as God's servant, even if all the others had fled.
Starting with the Black Plague and weaving through to the present, we reveal how the history of the Church is repeating itself in today's headlines. Why you are Catholic and don't know it. This is The Surprise Ending with Teresa Beam.
The sun had set that presentation of the Lord in the temple, Holy Day, in February of 1348. Agostino had just fallen asleep when his superior came to his room and asked him to dress and accompany him to give final unction or last rites to someone dying in a nearby farmhouse. The young priest jumped to his feet and began dressing. He was nervous. He had never given the final unction, but he knew he would be giving it often now. As the two left the monastery, a woman ran and pled with the superior to come with her and give last rites to a family dying in the city. That meant Agostino would be alone. His heart raced as he began praying the hours in his head and reciting the Psalms. As he neared the house, there was a dead cow lying near the road. He held his sleeve over his nose as to not inhale the poisoned air. When he got to the farmhouse, he knocked loudly upon the door and announced himself. No one answered till he pushed it open and stuck his head in, looking about with dread. Candles were still burning, telling him that there were people still alive in the house, or had been recently. He walked in and announced himself again loudly. An old, tattered man who was so dirty ran past him out the door. In another room, candlelight revealed a young woman no more than 14, shaking in a corner, sobbing as she held her torn garment against her breast. "Are you well?" the priest asked. "Becchino," sobbed the young girl. The priest had no idea that a group of grave diggers had been picking up dead bodies from the front of homes and would return to the homes where the women and old people had no one to protect them. They would rape, abduct, extort money from them, plunder their homes, or even murder the vulnerable who were grieving the death of their loved ones. The priest helped the woman to her bed and tried to soothe her. "Where are your parents?" "They left us," the young woman screamed over and over in hysteria. "They left us." The priest, now leery the Becchino that ran out earlier may have accomplices, went to check out the rest of the house. In one room, an elderly man and baby were lying still as death on the bed. It was almost time for matins when Agostino had taken care of the situation and had returned to the monastery. He read his office, said Mass in the chapel, and was heading for breakfast when his friend, Brother Giulio, stood at a distance from him, wild-eyed. He staggered a bit, and his speech was slurred as he asked Agostino to hear his confession, then burst into tears. Agostino understood and mustered his courage to hear his friend's last confession. By that evening, Agostino carried out Giulio's body and placed it in a grave with dozens of other bodies. To his horror, his eyes locked on two of the bodies he recognized. As Agostino returned to the monastery, he was exhausted and went to find something to drink. He noticed that it was very cold that February evening, but he was sweating. Blessings! This is the surprise ending podcast with my husband, Arthur, and myself, Teresa Beam.
Blessings to you.
This is what the podcast is about and the reason for it. You are Catholic and you don't know it. The way we think, our language, our perspective, and worldview come not from this vague notion of Western philosophy, Western thought, Western civilization. It's actually Catholic thought, Catholic culture, Catholic civilization. The West rides upon the Judeo-Christian philosophy and specifically Catholic culture that makes us who we are today. In these podcasts, we're going to explain how Catholic history affects the way we think and act today. We're going to start with the Black Plague and show how this in turn affected the Reformation and even into today and how we think. Okay, during the medieval time, the time we're talking about that led up to the Black Death, there were three different stations of social structure. There was the fighting class. They were the kings, the princes, the lords. These were the ones that were supposed to protect the kingdom. They wanted to make sure everybody was fed, everybody was, they had health care, they took care and made sure that everything worked properly. Like in this beehive, they were the ones that made sure that nobody came in and messed up the system. Then there was the praying class. That was the clergy. And the religious people, the nuns and the friars, the monks. They did the praying. Everyone was supposed to pray. But these were the people that did nothing but pray.
Professional prayers.
Yeah, they were professional prayers. The religious were supposed to be the ones who lived lives that were very, very holy. They didn't live like the laymen. They were mainly doing the sacraments for the next life in behalf of themselves as well as others. And then, of course, the class 3, the lowest class, was considered the workers. These were the ones who fed them. About 90% of people at that time were this peasant class, and they were agrarian. They grew the food. They made it all work. They were the bees making the honey in the beehive. How did this then affect the Reformation after the Black Plague? After the Black Plague, all of a sudden, there were no clergy. 90% of the clergy, unlike the rest of the European world, where about 50% died after these three major plague waves that went through Europe. There was 50% of the entire world, not just
It's a lot of people.
Yeah, not just in Europe, but all over. And so now you didn't have this praying class. And so what happened was...
Well, and also you could call them a shepherd class. The shepherd class was gone too.
That meant God was not in control. See, before they had felt safe, everything worked well together. It was like a beehive. Everything was understandable and the rhythm of life was good. But then after the plague...
Way more than 50% of the priests would die in certain regions.
All over the globe.
Right. Before this, you can recall and read many, many accounts of miraculous things happening through priests, through bishops. Yeah.
Especially during plagues.
Right.
And the plagues before, there had been the bishops would ask for the Lord and an angel would come. Even, in the one in Rome, remember?
Yes.
The archangel came and stopped the
Right.
plague in its tracks because of the bishop's prayer.
Right. Now these guys are dead.
Yeah. And so now everything had changed. The church was not able to have a miracle in order to stop this plague. And so the people stopped believing in the church.
So this brings up a very interesting guy. His name's Petrarch, he's kind of the father of humanism. So, tell me about him. What's important about him?
Well, Petrarch was a part of the holy orders. He wasn't a priest, I don't think, but he was
I guess I got confused with patriarch. He's Petrarch.
In the holy orders of the Catholic Church, and he was the 14th century Renaissance. He's kind of was one of the very first Renaissance men. Right before the Black Plague, he was on a climb to the top of a mountain in France, and this was April 26, 1336. And this was interesting. This is very notable for one reason, that he wasn't doing it as a pilgrimage. He took with him Augustine's Confessions. And when he was at the top, he kind of had an experience, a revelation. This was different for him because he was appreciating something outside of the holy order, something that the church told him to do to help make him holy, but yet he was appreciating this. This was a spiritual experience that had nothing to do with the church.
Right, taking in God's beauty, taking in the beauty of nature, all
Right.
things that God made.
Right. And so Petrarch then took this and started thinking about it. And then very soon after this, his son Giovanni died of the plague, as did his beautiful Laura. And he wrote some works, and I don't know how to say it, Secretarium Meum, I think is what. And it was written during the ravages of the plague. And what he decided was, after having been through the plague, he decided the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all could be holy in what they did every single day. We could be like little clergy in our daily work.
So I guess you would really have to define, obviously, humanism to him, he who made it, Petrarch, meant something different than it does to us today. What's the difference?
Yes, he started what's called Catholic humanism, which really wasn't anything different than the Catholic Church taught. It just had gotten
It's
very
still God focused.
right. It's very God focused, but it had just through the years, people had just relinquished the holiness of their lives to the clergy. And that actually was not a Catholic thing. It's just he kind of reinstituted this idea that the Catholics had always taught. And
So our focus now in humanism nowadays is focused on self.
right, and the humanistic tendencies today are secular, which Catholic humanism was deeply spiritual. Petrarch was a very devoted man to God and to the church. So then, 100 years later, after the Black Death, people were sick to death. 3 big, huge waves had come through Europe.
I'm surprised anybody lasted through it all.
Yeah, and people had just 100 years of death, fear, terror, and they were tired of it, and they wanted to feel like
It's just
life.
like a nightmare.
Right. They wanted to get out of it. They wanted to live life again. And this was where we got Erasmus and Thomas More, this Catholic humanism that was service to the church. Unfortunately, then, it was radicalized by the reformers, Philip Melanchthon, Ulrich Zwingli, and William Tyndale, who wanted to destroy the idea of the religious layer in the medieval and even would eventually change it after the Reformation.
So there's huge value in people who have given their whole entire life in study and in prayer. They have a living already built into it. They didn't make a ton of money, but their whole life was about prayer for themselves, prayer for the church, and prayer for every single person outside of it.
And after the Reformation, many Christians gave that up. I mean, the Catholics still have the nuns, but I mean, many of the post-Reformation organizations just simply don't have that anymore.
Right. That's right. That has dropped off, and yeah.
So, how we want to end this today is that if you believe that each one of our lives, even if it seems meaningless in the day-to-day stuff we do, we can still give it to the Lord. We can still live a life that's holy, and everything we do is used in the service of God, even if we're not praying.